Hi everybody, welcome to our second vodcast in our human anatomy unit. In this vodcast we're going to take a look at the different types of tissues that exist in animal type tissues and take a little bit of a look at some of the specific types and what they look like and what their functions are. So here we go. Animal tissue types come in a lot of different ways and they all, as we know, are made up of cells, particular specialized cells that are going to serve a very important purpose to the function of the tissue as a whole, and those tissues then go on to create our organs and so on. The first type we're going to spend some time talking about is epithelial. Epithelial tissue is defined by a type of cell and a type of tissue that has one side of it, one surface, is free, meaning it's exposed to air or to an outside, it's not connected, whereas the other side would be exposed, would be connected and anchored down to the other tissues and other types of surfaces. So these are going to be things that we can see, for one, and make up a lot of our canals and our areas. So the types of epithelial are stratified epithelial tissue. These are stratified cells that contain two or more layers of those cells stacked on top of one another. We have simple epithelial tissue, which is a single layer of those cell types, and some of those cell types are squamous. Squamous will make up our vessel linings. They are our alveoli sacs in our lungs. They create this, fine surface of a squamous cell will be our cheek lining, let's say. So our skin surface are squamous cells. They're very round, kind of abstracty in a sense, and kind of look like the word sounds. They're squishy. They're squamous cells. We also have cuboidal cells. These are the cells that are going to create the ducts, which are kind of like tubular secretion pathways. Our glands are going to have these, as well as the tubules, the testes, and the ovaries are made up of cuboidal epithelial. Right? Because as you can see, they're nice and square. The third type of epithelial tissue is called columnar epithelial. These are defined by having particular column type shapes here, which you can see. They run right down and they're very long and thin. And these also create ducts. They're glands. They're also found in our intestine, the uterus, our basically like our trachea. We have columnar epithelials for moving materials, and they're usually very, 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 very ciliated. And the main huge function of our epithelial tissue is for diffusion, it's for secretion, absorption, and it creates the ciliated cells that we have. So these are, really important type cells. Glands, collectively, as what a gland is, there are two types. There's exocrine glands and there's endocrine glands. Exocrine glands have ducts that, or tubes that open up to a free epithelial surface. So they're going to produce something that's going to get secreted through the ducts and released out through. Whereas an endocrine gland has zero ducts. The stuff that they secrete usually diffuse directly into blood capillaries and will usually create hormones and those kinds of secretions. So an endocrine gland has zero ducts, an exocrine gland does. So another type of tissue we have besides epithelial is also called connective tissue. And within the connective tissue we have cells that are often known as fibroblasts that are set within this sort of extracellular matrix, this material that holds them together. So for example, we have loose connective tissue. It's going to appear, just as it sounds, it's got this very fibrous, very loose looking tissue appearance. Fibers seem to be kind of everywhere. They're in this sort of semi-fluid substance, and they're the support framework, or what we call the basement membrane generally, for our epithelial tissue, our epithelium. And these, they're kind of there to hold and be a connector. So if you have, the tissues that hold our organs in place are often connective tissues that are going to keep things where they should be, but allow enough movement for them to kind of move around a little bit. We have fibrous or irregular connective tissue. The fibers and the collagens are what are going to support our organs. These again have not a real formal appearance. You know, they don't seem to be very organized. They're very irregular in how they're put together, and they have this sort of flowy, but not quite as open feeling as the loose connective tissue has. So we find these, you know, kind of supportive around, and you've got collagen fibers in here, which are very, very strong protein fibers to kind of help pull that through. Then we have fibrous but regular connective tissue. These has tons of collagen, and this is what makes up our tendons and our ligaments. So we'll talk a little bit more, but for, you know, your own understanding, tendons are what hold our muscle to our bone. So they're the anchor points of bringing our skeletal muscle and connecting it to our bone, like your Achilles tendon that connects your calf muscle to your calcaneus or the back of your heel. Whereas a ligament is what's going to connect a bone to a bone. So, you know, you've I'm sure heard of your anterior cruciate ligament, your ACL. You hear about people tearing theirs, and that's a ligament that sits behind your knee. So it's posterior to your knee, and you've got two that connect, you know, your legs together, and you have two ligaments that run kind of cross. Well, your anterior cruciate ligament is the one that sits above the other one, and oftentimes that one can be ripped or torn. There are also various forms of very specialized connective tissues, and our histology lab, again, you're exploring some of these in that. We have cartilage. Cartilage is a really necessary, it's an important connective tissue. We find it, you guys know, your ends of your nose, your ears, that's got support, but it's not hard like bone is. And it's there to allow for support, but have some flexion as well. And much of our early bone starts off as cartilage when we're born and then begins to form into more full bone. Second type bone, very, very hard connective tissue. And our bone tissue has a very calcified, very, very hard matrix that we have. We have a series of what to me always looked like tree rings create this Haversian canal system that allows in this area here to have a blood vessel run through it, because if it's so hard it can't run through. You have all of the bone cells, all those little black dots, basically here, here, and here, are called osteocytes, and those are going to form this bone tissue and secrete this matrix and keep adipose tissue. That's our fat tissue, and these are super interesting because they are just full of lipid, full of fat, tightly compacted, but appear, when you look at them under the microscope, to be extraordinarily empty. And they are found, you know, under the skin, around the heart. They're cushioning. They're there for energy storage, padding, shock absorption. That's the reason why we have adipose tissue. And then on the, you know, as we work through, you can see we're going from very hard types of connective tissues to liquid connective tissue. And blood is a connective tissue. It's a series of cells that function for, you know, that have a particular function and carry out a job. So it is a tissue, even though it's fluid. And it's made up of several things, from your white blood cells, that's your army, that's your immune system, that's going to help fight anything that comes in or needs healing. Red blood cells, we know by this point, are uber important because they carry the oxygen from place to place. Platelets are little cell remnants, if you will. They're involved directly with our clotting ability to stop bleeding if it happens. They kind of gather in there and, you know, kind of clog up a tear. One thing to kind of keep in mind as you go through these is not just knowing, okay, here's the types, but they all have very, very particular functions, right? So cartilage, that's support, but for flexibility, you've got bone, which is all support, right? I mean, that is hugely supportive. And it's also vastly important for the creation of our blood cells. So bone tissue, the marrow of that is where our blood cells are made. And the cells that make them up, the products that are created from these, determine the function, right? So we can explore what they're made of, what they create, and things like that, and from that understand more about what the function is of these. Another type of tissue that we'll play around with a little bit is muscle tissue. It's very elastic. It contracts when it's stimulated, which is a good thing. That's why we can move. But again, that elasticity piece is it returns to its original form after it's been contracted. Three main types of muscle tissue include the skeletal or striated which is striated tissue, and it allows us for voluntary movement. It's what makes us get from point A to point B, and it kind of allows us to move our bones around. It's organized very, very importantly from a more, from the bigger picture, from the muscle fibers, which are your cells, to the pieces within the muscle fiber that hold the protein called a myofibril, to a sarcomere, which is one contractile unit, is considered a sarcomere. And we'll explore that down the road. So again, that contractile unit. Cardiac muscle, that's your heart muscle, and it's striated as well, but it is involuntary. We can't purposefully contract our heart, which is a good thing, because otherwise we'd be kind of out of luck when we were sleeping, to allow for our heart to continue to beat. So very, very fast signaling conductors. It has its own innervation for nerve. It kind of promotes its own action potential. It has tons of mitochondria because it needs to constantly beat, so it's using up tons of energy. And so again, I think the heart's a neat organ. Smooth muscle is another last type of muscle. You can see it doesn't have those striations. The organization looks a little looser. It's involuntary muscle. This is muscle like our diaphragm that has to contract and relax for breathing. Our stomach, as it pulses and you get peristalsis and the movement of materials through our digestive system, are all the result of the movement through smooth muscle. And again, we can't control these ones, consciously control them. We do control them, but consciously we can't control them. So a lot of our internal organs, as I mentioned, is part of that, and they can have sustained contractions and then release. Last type of tissue I'm going to talk about in this podcast is nervous tissue. This is extraordinarily important because this is how the signals get sent from place to place. Electrical signals run through, and you have this sort of intake of a signal. You get the initiation and the conduction of the signal, and finally the release of whatever's supposed to happen. The neuron is the main functioning cell within nervous tissue. It's very electrically active. We'll talk specifically about how that signal moves down a neuron. A couple types of neurons exist. We have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So it kind of works this way, where the sensory neuron is the neuron that takes in the information, so it registers that something is going on. An interneuron is kind of the relay messenger from the sensory. The motor neuron is then the neuron that then acts at the muscle to create the response. So let's say, for example, I put my hand, as we've all done at some point, you put your hand on something hot, right? So the sensory neurons are going to pick up the heat. The interneurons are relaying the message back to your brain, and then the signal is coming down motor neurons that are then acting back at my arm to move my hand back. So we have this complete, really, really interesting communication method via our neurons. Neuroglial cells are found in there. They're very highly specialized neurons that are highly specialized cells that support our neurons and create things to make that signaling much more likely. They support them by nourishing them, by maintaining them, by helping increase conductivity. And again, we'll get into more of this down the road. Super fast communication, amazingly fast communication between neurons, which is amazing in its sense. So it's a pretty neat tissue itself too, and we'll explore a little bit more of this as well. So that's going to be it for today. Go back, kind of write down, this is just kind of an overview. We're getting to see how these work while we spend some time in the lab, which is kind of nice. And we'll get an opportunity to kind of see how these tissues interplay with some of the systems that we're going to cover. So have a great night, and catch you guys later.